Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton. Pleased to announce that I am joined here by Dr. John Joy, who is going to be delivering a lecture here in our Reason and Theology Lecture Series, and it's going to be on the Assent Ode to Non-Infallible Teachings of the Magisterium. How are you, Dr. Joy? It's great to have you back on the show, by the way.
I'm doing great, Michael. Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be back.
It's an honor to have you, and I'll tell you, I've learned so much from you, and I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot from this. So I'm really excited. Let me go ahead and formally introduce you. Dr. Joy is the president of the St. Albert the Great Center for Scholastic Studies. His primary academic interests are in theology and philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, dogmatic theology, and especially questions on infallibility in the magisterium of the church, which is my personal favorite topic. He's the author of On the Ordinary and Extraordinary Magisterium from Joseph Kloitgen to the Second Vatican Council, and he is also senior theologian to the Bishop of Madison. So once again, Dr. Joy, it is great to have you on, and I look forward to this. So if you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thanks so much, Michael. So yeah, like Michael just said, my topic is the Assent Ode to the Non-Infallible Teaching of the Magisterium. I've got a handful of introductory comments, and then I'll kind of get into the body of the lecture. So first of all, the topic of the Assent Ode to the Non-Infallible Teaching of the Magisterium presupposes that there is such a category as non-infallible teaching of the magisterium, which is, I would say, the most common view of Catholic theologians by far, but certainly there are still some who don't share that view. So I'm actually going to format this lecture in a kind of scholastic style disputation format, where the question I'll be addressing explicitly is whether there is such a thing as the non-infallible magisterium. And then in the body of that, I'll give a description of what the Assent ode to that. I'll be arguing that there is such a thing as the non-infallible magisterium, and in the body, give an explanation of what the Assent ode to that kind of teaching is. The format, so a comment then on the format I just mentioned of a scholastic disputation. As Michael mentioned, I'm kind of an Aquinas junkie, so one of my roles in my spare time is as the managing editor for the Aquinas Institute, which is publishing the complete works of Aquinas in Latin English. I don't know if you've seen these big blue hardcover volumes of the Latin English opera Omnia of Aquinas. So I spend a lot of my spare time, what little I have, editing Aquinas's works. And so I've been deeply into the kind of objections and sed contra and respondeo. And recently in my own writing, I just decided to try that, what it was like to write in that style. Nobody writes that way anymore. And I found it fascinating, enjoyable, and actually helpful for being able to clarify my own thoughts and arguments and so on. Now, I'll warn you, I've never tried giving a lecture verbally in that format. So if this is a total bust, my apologies ahead of time. The most difficult part of the Aquinas' kind of Summa Theologiae format is that when you get to the replies to the objections, especially if you're not looking at a text, you might have forgotten what the objections were. So when I reply to objections, I'll make sure to re-summarize what the objection was, and I think it'll be relatively easy to follow. Third kind of introductory comment, I'm going to be talking explicitly about papal magisterium and papal infallibility and so on, but everything that I have to say about this could be applied pretty much directly to the theology of the magisterium of an ecumenical council as well. So if you have any questions at the end about the teaching of councils, that's all fair game, but I'll warn you, my answer is going to be, hey, exactly what I said about the Pope pretty much applies to the ecumenical council. Fourth kind of preliminary point is my whole study of these topics and my whole perspective is from the dogmatic and not the apologetic side, which means I simply am presupposing here that the teaching of Vatican I is true. I'm not trying to give a justification for the church's teaching about the magisterium. I'm just trying to give an explication of it. So if there are non-Catholics in the audience, take this not as, I'm not going to try to convince you on this topic that the Catholic Church's teaching is true. but hopefully I will be able to give you a clearer understanding of what the Catholic Church's position on this subject is. Again, I'm happy to field questions on the apologetic line at the end, but I won't promise you any brilliant answers. I'll do my best, but I'm really a dogmatic theologian, not an apologist. Fifth preliminary point is my kind of interest in the subject. So I'm going to be emphasizing here, I'm going to be arguing that the Pope is not always infallible, even in his official magisterial teaching, which means I'm going to be stressing the kind of limitations on papal infallibility. I don't want that to be mistaken as a kind of downplaying of papal infallibility. I do believe the teaching of Vatican I. And in fact, my original interest in this subject came out of my own kind of frustration in my graduate school work about a kind of minimalistic interpretation of papal infallibility. In other words, I kept hearing that the Pope has only spoken infallibly twice in the whole history of the Church, and I just couldn't believe that was true. So I investigated the subject originally with the idea of arguing for a more expansive understanding of papal infallibility than the common kind of opinion that you'll often encounter. And I do still hold that there have been more than two ex cathedra statements in the history of the Church, quite a few more than two. So depending on who you're comparing me against, you might think I'm either a maximalist or a minimalist in terms of papal infallibility. So I think there have been more than two instances of infallible papal teaching, but at the same time, I don't think everything the Pope teaches is infallible. I'm somewhere in the middle. So my original intention in studying this topic was from a point of view of emphasizing that infallibility goes further than a lot of people think. However, recently, in the last several years, there seems to be a lot more interest in the topic of where are the limits of papal infallibility? Can the Pope actually teach something false in his official magisterium? And if so, what's the kind of Catholic response to that? So that's more the angle I'm addressing here today. One final preliminary note before I get into the kind of scholastic disputation here is about the history of this topic, the history of this discussion about non-infallible magisterial teaching. It's a topic that really wasn't discussed by theologians with any kind of systematic or rigor or in an explicit kind of way, pretty much until Vatican I. So you're not going to find any of the fathers making this distinction. You're not going to find any of the great scholastics like Aquinas making this distinction. The first, I think the earliest theologian I know of who discusses it explicitly is Pietro Ballerini in the late 1700s. However, that doesn't mean it's hard to know what to make out of that with the medieval theologians, for example. So you'll find like Gratian, for example, the kind of medieval canon law. Gratian taught that scholars of Scripture are preeminent over even the Pope when interpreting and expounding Scripture, while the Pope is preeminent on matters that must be defined. So there does seem to have been an awareness at some level that not all papal teaching is infallible definition. So they seem to have been aware of this category. I just ran across recently, actually, Aquinas in the Tertia Pars of the Summa, question 78, article 1, is talking about the form, the sacramental form of the Eucharist. And he quotes something said by Pope Leo XIII, which Aquinas disagrees with, and says, since the Pope was wrong here, we ought to interpret what he said not so much as making a determination, which would be like a definition, so much as giving his opinion. Now, the weird thing about that is that what Aquinas quotes from Pope Leo XIII there was actually said by Pope Leo XIII, sorry, not the 13th. What am I even saying, Leo XIII? That's quite recent. Innocent III. He was quoting Innocent III, something he'd written before becoming Pope. So in fact, what he quoted wasn't magisterial at all, but the way Aquinas treats it, he still attributes it to Pope Innocent III and says it should be understood as him giving his opinion, not making a determination. So it's a little hard to know what to make out of the medieval kind of discussions of these questions. There seems to have been an awareness that the Pope is only infallible under certain circumstances, but they just don't talk about what that means for the rest of the cases. So pretty much everything I'm going to draw from here is going to be Vatican I and forward, because that's really when the discussion picks up. Okay, I think that's enough by way of an introduction. Certainly, we'll try to leave some room for questions at the end if you want to come back to any of that. So in the scholastic style here now, the question is whether the Pope is able to teach any error at all in the exercise of his authentic magisterium. First objection. It would seem that the Pope is not able to teach any error at all in his authentic magisterium, that is, his official teaching on matters of faith or morals. For what is taught by the Pope is taught by the Church. And according to the Catechism of the Council of Trent, the Church cannot err in faith or morals. Similarly, the Baltimore Catechism says the Church cannot err when it teaches a doctrine of faith or morals. And what the Pope teaches, the Church teaches. Therefore, the Pope cannot teach any error in any of his official teaching. Second objection, Pope John Paul II, in a series of general audiences which he devoted to a catechesis on the Creed, he was speaking about the ordinary or merely authentic magisterium of the Pope, which he contrasted against the extraordinary or solemn ex cathedra teaching of the Pope. And he says, alongside the infallibility of ex cathedra definitions, there is also the charism of the Holy Spirit's assistance granted to Peter and his successors, so that they would not err in matters of faith and morals, but rather shed great light on the Christian people. This charism, John Paul II goes on, is not limited to exceptional cases, but embraces in varying degrees the whole exercise of the magisterium. End quote. So back in 2017, Stephen Walford, one of the public defenders of Pope Francis's more controversial statements, built his case for the total infallibilization of everything Pope Francis teaches on the basis of that citation from John Paul II in an article for Vatican Insider. Not exactly a scholarly publication, but anyway. Third objection. According to the Second Vatican Council, the faithful are obliged to accept the teaching of the authentic papal magisterium, even when he is not speaking ex cathedra, with a religious submission of will and intellect. If, therefore, the Pope were able to teach error in any of his official magisterial teaching, then Catholics would be required to accept, to give this religious submission of will and intellect to something that could potentially be false, which would be intolerable. Fourth objection, the Pope is the final judge in matters of faith and morals. Hence, there can be no legitimate dissent from any papal teaching, nor appeal to any higher authority. This would place the faithful in an impossible situation if the Pope were at all able to teach error. Fifth objection, according to Cardinal Bellarmine, it was in his time a pious and probable opinion that the sovereign pontiff not only cannot err as pontiff, but also that as a particular person, he cannot be a heretic by obstinately believing something false contrary to the faith. Then, according to Bishop Gasser, in his official explanation of the meaning of the definition of papal infallibility, which he gave to the bishops at Vatican I, on behalf of the deputation that drafted the text, the First Vatican Council raised to a dogma the teaching of St. Robert Bellarmine regarding the extent of papal infallibility. Therefore, although it was only a pious and probable opinion in Bellarmine's time, it is now a dogma of faith that the Pope is in no way able to teach error in matters of faith or morals. Emmett O'Regan built an argument on the basis of, built that argument on the basis of Bishop Gasser's Relatio at Vatican I, also in Vatican Insider back in 2017. Objection 6, according to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, propositions contrary to the non-definitive teaching of the authentic magisterium can be qualified as false, or in the case of teachings of the prudential order, as rash or dangerous, and therefore unable to be safely taught, end quote. But if all speculative propositions contrary to the teaching of the authentic magisterium can be qualified as false, then all such propositions taught by the authentic magisterium must be true. Therefore, they cannot contain error. Objection 7, according to Cardinal Franzelin, a prominent 19th century theologian, in addition to the gift of infallible truth, which protects the ex cathedra definitions of the Pope, there is also the gift of infallible security, which guarantees that all official papal teaching, even if not infallibly true, is at least infallibly safe, so that it would always be safe for the faithful to embrace it and could never be safe not to embrace it. Therefore, the authentic magisterium of the Pope is at least practically infallible. Objection 8, final objection. According to Cardinal Below, a prominent ecclesiologist of the early 20th century, the non-definitive exercise of the authentic magisterium consists in probabilistic rather than in certain judgments. That is, when the Pope teaches a doctrine of faith or morals, without intending to proclaim it definitively, he should be understood as proposing that this doctrine is probably true and therefore safe to hold in light of current knowledge. Such teaching is reformable in the sense that the church later, enlightened by new knowledge, could teach that the reverse is actually true. And yet this would not make the previous teaching false, since it was rightly considered probable at the time. So Below interprets even a reversal of this kind of teaching down the line as not implying any false teaching at either stage. He tries to claim that without violating the principle of non-contradiction by saying that all that was originally claimed was that the teaching was probably true in light of current knowledge. Later on, if knowledge develops or new information is found, and we end up saying that that's false, that doesn't mean that it was a false judgment to say that it was probably true in light of previous knowledge. So to quote Below, that which is not safe now, looking at the present state of the question, can later become safe when new evidence has appeared, and thus the decision declaring as safe that which was said before not to be safe would not, strictly speaking, be a reformation of the sentence, but a new declaration not contrary to the prior one, end quote. Okay, so those are 8 arguments which seem to advance the case that the Pope is always infallible when he's exercising his magisterium in matters of faith or morals. On the contrary, according to Pope John Paul II, quote, the non-infallible expressions of the authentic magisterium of the Church should be received with religious submission of mind and will. That's from a very low-level statement, a speech he gave to the US bishops on their ad limina visit back in 1988, so not a very high degree of authority. But if you want to make the case that all official papal teaching is infallible, then you're going to have to take even that kind of authority pretty seriously. So he says the non-infallible expressions of the authentic magisterium. But if there are non-infallible expressions of the authentic magisterium, then it is possible for the authentic magisterium to teach error. And this is a crucial logical point that I'm going to insist upon, even though it should seem obvious. If it's not infallible, that means it's fallible. Even if you're uncomfortable with that word, logically speaking, there's no third option. So if it's not infallible, then it's fallible. And if it's fallible, then it's able to fail, which means it could sometimes contain error. Okay, I answer that. It is possible for the Pope to teach error in the exercise of his authentic magisterium, that is, his official teaching on faith or morals addressed to the universal church. However, we should believe that the divine assistance granted to the Pope in virtue of his supreme office will prevent that from occurring very frequently. And I think church history bears that out, that this is an infrequent occurrence. In order to understand why the Pope is not infallible in all of his teaching, we must consider the purpose of infallibility. The gift of infallibility has been given to the church by God in order to protect faithful Catholics from being forced into holding false opinions on matters of faith or morals which would jeopardize their salvation. Now, let me say that again. It's been given to the church in order to protect faithful Catholics from being forced by obedience into holding false opinions in matters of faith or morals, which would jeopardize their salvation. Since the solemn judgments or definitions of the Pope are strictly and absolutely binding in conscience, if the Pope were able to teach falsely in such definitive judgments, then all of Christ's faithful could be strictly obliged as a matter of obedience to believe something against the faith. That must be impossible. But when the Pope teaches a matter of faith or morals in his authentic magisterium without speaking ex cathedra, then he does not require a definitive assent from the faithful. So, if he should err in such teaching, although certainly many might be deceived, no one would be forced by obedience into believing the error, and so the whole church would not necessarily be led astray. I'm not trying to say it wouldn't be a disaster. Certainly it would be a disaster for many souls, but nobody would be forced by the virtue of obedience into heresy, apostasy, or grave error concerning the faith. Many might be tricked into it, but nobody would be forced by obedience into it. And so we must conclude that this kind of teaching does not need to be absolutely protected from every error. At the same time, it is more fitting that even this kind of teaching should be protected from frequent error, lest anyone be led to conclude that the Church does not enjoy divine assistance in the integral exercise of its mission. That's partially a quote from the CDF document Donum Veritatis. The non-infallibility, so let me just quick note, that is a kind of speculative argument as to why the authentic magisterium of the Pope is not infallible. In other words, it's an argument based on the nature of infallibility and its purpose, not based on source texts. The second part here, we can make the same case based on positive texts of the Church. So a positive argument for the non-infallibility of the authentic magisterium. This can be established on the basis of the Second Vatican Council's teaching in Lumen Gentium, according to which the response owed by the faithful to the authentic magisterium of the Pope when he is not speaking ex cathedra is, quote, a religious submission of will and intellect. Now we'll have to unpack what that phrase means, but according to the official notes on this text provided by the Theological Commission at Vatican II, so in other words, the notes on the text that were distributed to the bishops in order to help them understand the text when they were voting on it and discussing it. This statement in Lumen Gentium 25 about the assent of religious submission of will and intellect is intended to be understood in reference to non-infallible teaching. That's clarified in the notes. So in two places. First, there's a note in the Relatio that this clause was added, quote, in order to determine further what assent ought to be given to the teaching of the authentic magisterium below the grade of infallibility, end quote. And then again, when the same text was relocated, they were shuffling around the parts of Lumen Gentium. There's another note in a further Relatio saying, quote, it seemed better to treat of the non-infallible magisterium of the Roman Pontiff in the context of the magisterium of the whole episcopal body, end quote. So it's clear, therefore, that according to the meaning of Lumen Gentium 25, as it was understood by the bishops at the Second Vatican Council as they were writing the text, discussing it, and voting on it, this is meant to be understood in reference to the non-infallible authentic magisterium of the Pope. But again, if it's not infallible, that means it could sometimes fail, which means it could sometimes contain error. So what is this religious submission of will and intellect? First, it describes a genuine interior assent of the mind and not merely an external attitude of respect. However, the kind of assent asked for in this religious submission has the character of opinion rather than knowledge, since the teaching is to be accepted as true, but with the awareness that it could possibly be false. That's the kind of provisional assent which we usually express by saying, I think this is true, rather than the definitive assent implied when we say, I know this is true. So let me go over that point one more time. In Thomas Aquinas in the De Veritate 14, question 14, article 1, and also in the Summa Theologiae, question 2, article 1, sorry, Secunda Secundae, question 2, article 1, where he's talking about the nature of faith in both those contexts. He distinguishes between various different kinds of acts of the mind. So he distinguishes between understanding, knowledge, opinion, suspicion, doubt, and faith as various attitudes of the mind towards a given proposition. So I won't go through all of those, but the basic difference between opinion and knowledge, the way Aquinas describes it, is that knowledge is when you can see the truth of something. He says you can see the truth of the conclusion in the light of the premises. And so you have complete certainty that something is true. So 2 + 2 is 4. Yes, I know that's true. I don't say I think 2 + 2 is 4. I either just say 2 + 2 is 4, or I say I know that 2 + 2 is 4. Whereas when we say something, an opinion, so in the scholastic terminology anyway for Aquinas, an opinion is not quite what people often mean by that today. That term gets used a lot of times to mean something like a purely subjective preference. Like, I like chocolate ice cream better than vanilla. That's just your opinion, man. Or especially in morals, people like to do that a lot. For Aquinas, an opinion is more like when we say things that we genuinely think are objectively true, but we know that we're not quite sure and we could turn out to be wrong. So it's the kind of thing that you might say, well, I'm a baseball fan, so I'll take a baseball example. The Detroit Tigers have been terrible for the last several years. They're actually doing mediocre so far this year, if you've been paying attention. But I can say I genuinely think that the Tigers will not win the World Series this year. I really think that. But that's an opinion, because even while I really do think that's true, I also know that it could turn out to be false, which is something very different from saying, like the last time the Tigers won the World Series was 1984. I know that's true. I don't have any fear that it might turn out to be false. So the kind of assent given to a proposition when we form an opinion about something is a provisional kind of assent. It's a real internal assent. I really do think it's true, but it's a provisional rather than definitive kind of assent, because it's an assent formed with an awareness all throughout that it could actually turn out not to be true. So since the kind of teaching that we're talking about here, with non-infallible magisterial teaching, some kind of assent is expected from Catholics, this religious submission of will and intellect. It's a submission of the will and the intellect, which implies that it's exterior. So it means more than just, if you disagree, don't say anything about it. It's the will and intellect that are supposed to submit, so it's interior. But since we're talking about non-infallible teaching, it has to be, by the logic of the case, the kind of assent that we give when we have an awareness that it could turn out to be false. So I think the best analogy for that, or the most helpful way to understand that, is the kind of thinking or the kind of assent that we commonly have when we form opinions about things, rather than the kind of assent that we have either in genuine kind of scientific knowledge or in matters of faith, when we have the real certitude of theological faith based on the infallibility of divine revelation and so on. So, at least generally speaking, this kind of opinionative agreement, or agreement in the nature of an opinion, is the response owed by faithful Catholics to the official but not infallible teaching of a pope or an ecumenical council. The question that always comes up then is, can this kind of assent or religious submission ever be legitimately withheld by a faithful Catholic? And the answer has to be yes. The authentic magisterium of the Pope or bishops certainly deserves the benefit of the doubt. We should always presume that any official teaching of the magisterium is true, but that presumption can be rebutted by sufficient evidence to the contrary. So, a warning, it would be rash and dangerous for any of us to withhold assent from any magisterial teaching merely on the basis of our own private judgment. But in the hypothetical case that something taught by the authentic magisterium would contradict, would clearly and openly conflict with any of the irreformable doctrine of the church, then assent must be withheld. So how does this square with the obligation to give religious submission of will and intellect, even to non-infallible teaching? The way that I would explain this, why it is in fact justified to withhold our assent from this kind of teaching in certain cases, is a really basic principle of morals, that in the case of conflicting obligations, precedence must always be given to the higher or the stricter obligation. So for example, in an emergency, the obligation to obey traffic laws gives way to the higher obligation to save lives. So imagine this scenario where you're speeding to the hospital in order to save somebody's life. The general obligation to obey traffic laws gives way to the higher obligation to save lives. So similarly, I think in this case, if we have both, we have to say we have a strict and absolute obligation to give definitive assent to the infallible teaching of the church, and a general lower level obligation to give this kind of religious submission to the non-infallible teaching of the church. In the hypothetical case of a conflict, it's clear to me that the lower obligation simply has to give way to the higher obligation. A useful analogy, I think, to explain the same thing is the way we usually teach children about the fourth commandment. So the general explanation of the fourth commandment will be a kind of unqualified statement: children ought to obey their parents. The fourth commandment says children should obey their parents. But of course, we also understand, even while saying this, and at some point in the children's development, we have to clarify this, that of course, if a parent were to command their children to commit a sin, which is hypothetically possible, then in that case, children must actually disobey their parents out of respect for the higher law of God, and their disobedience in this case would not count as breaking the fourth commandment, since their parents would be acting outside the legitimate sphere of their authority. So I think in a very similar way, faithful children of the church have a general duty to accept the official teaching of the Pope and bishops in union with him, even when they're not teaching infallibly. But as we mature in our understanding of the faith, we ought to understand, and this is probably overdue to be clarified, that if our spiritual fathers tell us to think something contrary to what God has revealed and the church has infallibly taught, then the faithful children of the church must respectfully disagree. And this does not count as disobedience to the church, since they would in this case be acting outside the legitimate sphere of authority entrusted them by Christ. Now, in order to do this, so again, just as a 10-year-old kid, in order to apply that distinction well, has to know the law of God well in order to know whether his parents' commands are asking him to depart from it. Similarly, in order for Catholics to apply this distinction well, they have to take care to be formed in the tradition of the church, especially the scriptures, the common teaching of the fathers and doctors, and the infallible decrees of popes and councils throughout history, so that they would not be led astray if their own bishop or the pope, or as St. Paul says, even an angel from heaven should preach a gospel contrary to that which was received from the apostles. So it's not good enough at a certain point to just think that you're okay by believing everything which the Pope says in his merely authentic magisterium, if you don't also take care to form yourself in the whole tradition of the church, and especially the scriptures and tradition. Okay, that is all I have for the body of the article. I'm going to come back to the objections. I think we're still doing okay on time here. I'll just try to summarize the objections again before I reply to them briefly to make sure that we don't lose track of what's going on here. So, reply to the first objection, which was arguing that the Pope must always be infallible because the Church is always infallible, which you can easily get this impression from the Catechism of the Council of Trent, the Baltimore Catechism, other places as well. The Church can't teach error is often asserted without qualification. The Church is the spotless bride of Christ. The Church can't teach error. And we do have a habit of saying, Catholics have a habit of saying, the Church teaches X, Y, or Z because we read it in a papal encyclical. So we have a habit of equating the teaching of the Pope and the teaching of the Church in a kind of non-discriminating way. So against this objection, I reply that when the Pope or bishops exercise their merely authentic, non-infallible magisterium, this can only be described as the teaching of the Church in a loose or improper sense. When the Pope or bishops teach infallibly, then it can be said simply and properly that the Church teaches X, Y, or Z. But when the Pope exercises his authentic magisterium without speaking infallibly, then it should be said more properly that the Pope teaches X, Y, or Z. And thus, if he should err in such teaching, we would say that the Pope has erred and not that the Church has erred. An indication of this can be seen in the concluding formula of the Profession of Faith issued by the CDF in 1998, which speaks in the first two paragraphs of the definitive assent ode to the infallible teaching of the Church. In the first two paragraphs, where it's talking about infallible magisterial teaching, it always speaks about the Church as the subject of teaching. But then in the third paragraph, where it speaks about the religious submission of will and intellect due to the non-definitive teaching of the magisterium, it doesn't anymore speak of the teaching of the Church here, but speaks of the teaching of the Pope or of the College of Bishops, which they give when not speaking infallibly. I think an example of or an illustration of this, an analogy for this, is like if you're traveling and you go through border patrol coming into the United States, the border guard stamps your passport, you enter the country, you might very easily say in a loose kind of way of speaking, the United States, let me in. Of course, because the border guard acting kind of in his capacity on behalf of the United States, you can kind of make that equation. Although strictly speaking, it'd be more accurate to say the border guard let me in. And you can see the difference, especially when the border guard messes up something. So if he stamps your passport upside down, for example, you would never show your friends your passport and say, look, the United States stamped my passport upside down. So there's a way we have of when an agent of an organization is properly fulfilling his role on behalf of the organization, we attribute what he does to the organization. Whereas when he messes up, it would be laughable to attribute that to the organization. I think we grasp that pretty easily with commonplace examples. I'm just making the case here that we ought to apply the same kind of reasoning to the hypothetical case of error in the teaching of a pope or bishop. To the second objection, which cited the words of Pope John Paul II, saying that the Holy Spirit is given to popes even in their ordinary magisterium so that they would not teach error, I reply that in the same series of general audiences, he also says that the Pope is infallible only when he speaks ex cathedra. Now, if the Pope is infallible only when he speaks ex cathedra, then he is not infallible when he does not speak ex cathedra, and therefore he is able to teach error, even in matters of faith or morals, in his authentic magisterium when not speaking ex cathedra. In other words, if what John Paul II says here is true, that the Pope is infallible only when he speaks ex cathedra, then the objection fails. And if what he says is false, then the objection still fails, because that would mean he taught something false in his authentic magisterium. So I think this is a dilemma that that, as far as I can see, really clinches the case. It's a funny one because it's a very low-level Wednesday audience. But if you're really going to say that popes never err in their authentic magisterium, then you'd have to say that John Paul II erred here, which is low level, but still authentic magisterium. So how to understand what he says, the charism of the Holy Spirit's assistance, about which the Pope speaks in the passage quoted here, cannot be understood as an absolute protection against error, such as is given in the case of infallible teaching, but rather a grace of office, which the Pope must avail himself of in order to benefit from. Just as grace is given to the justified so that they would not sin, but not so that they could not sin. In other words, I think in the authentic magisterium of the Pope, the assistance of the Holy Spirit is available so that he would not teach error even in his non-infallible teaching. But the grace is not given such that he could not teach error, and so a Pope who didn't avail himself of the grace available could still teach error. To the third objection, which was that the authentic magisterium of the Pope must be infallible because Catholics owe it a religious submission of will and intellect, I reply that this same religious submission of will and intellect is also due, according to Lumen Gentium 25, to the teaching of individual bishops who are certainly not infallible. So think of the heretic Nestorius, for example. According to Lumen Gentium 25, the good Catholics of the city of Constantinople in the time of Nestorius owed to Nestorius, to his teaching in matters of faith and morals, a religious submission of will and intellect. Now, you can't think that that meant that they ought to have believed his heresies. And so if that kind of assent doesn't force us to think that Nestorius is infallible, which it clearly doesn't, then it also doesn't force us to think that the Pope is infallible, since we owe the same response to him in his non-infallible teaching. To the fourth objection, which argued that the Pope must always be infallible because he's the final judge in matters of faith and morals, I reply that the Pope, even though he is the final judge, he is not always acting as the final judge, but only is acting as the final judge when he speaks ex cathedra. Hence, if there should be controversy over a doctrine taught by the Pope in the exercise of his non-infallible magisterium, where he proposes a doctrine of faith or morals as true, but not in the form of a solemn or final judgment, then the faithful are not left without recourse. They can appeal to the same Pope or to a future Pope to issue a definitive judgment on the disputed point and so remove all doubts. And as long as the Pope does not do so, it's clear that he does not demand an absolute assent to his teaching. To the fifth objection, which argued that the First Vatican Council dogmatized the opinion which Bellarmine called pious and probable, I reply that this is expressly contradicted by the very source on which it relies. Bishop Gasser, in his official explanation of the definition of papal infallibility at Vatican I, says that, quote, as far as the doctrine set forth in the draft goes, the deputation is unjustly accused of wanting to raise an extreme opinion, namely that of Albert Pigius, to the dignity of a dogma. For the opinion of Pigius, which Bellarmine indeed calls pious and probable, was that the Pope, as an individual person or a private teacher, was able to err from a type of ignorance, but was never able to fall into heresy or teach heresy. From this, it appears that the doctrine in the proposed chapter is not that of Albert Pigius or the extreme opinion of any school, but rather that it is the one and same which Bellarmine teaches in the place cited, and which Bellarmine adduces in the fourth place and calls most certain and assured. So it is, just to repeat or to summarize, it is ludicrous to claim on the basis of Bishop Gasser's speech that Vatican I dogmatized Albert Pigius's opinion, on the extreme opinion about the extent of papal infallibility. He expressly rules that out. The sixth objection argued that the teaching of the authentic magisterium must always be true because the commentary of the CDF on the concluding formula of the profession of faith qualifies the contrary teaching as false. I reply to this in the first place that this doctrinal commentary carries no magisterial authority. The commentary on the concluding formula of the profession of faith issued by Cardinal Ratzinger and Bertone was issued without the seal of papal approval, by which, according to Donum Veritatis 18, the doctrinal decrees of the CDF participate in the ordinary magisterium of the Pope. It is given from the offices of the CDF, but without any kind of papal approval. It is therefore permissible for a Catholic to hold that it simply errs on this point. Instead of describing propositions contrary to non-infallible magisterial teaching as false, it would have been more accurate to describe all such propositions, and not only those of the prudential order, as rash or dangerous and therefore not able to be safely taught. For this would correspond more closely to the limited but real authority of the kind of teaching in question. That is, since it is not infallible, it could occasionally be false, and thus the contrary could be true. But because it is authoritative, there is a strong presumption of truth in its favor, on account of which it would be rash and dangerous to hold the contrary without sufficiently grave cause. The seventh objection, which was based on Cardinal Francelin's distinction between infallible truth and infallible security, I replied that the Cardinal was concerned to emphasize the authority of the authentic papal magisterium against those who would feel themselves free to disregard everything except infallible teaching, but he overstated his case by failing to even consider the possibility of authoritative papal teaching that would be in conflict with the previous teaching of the Church. So his emphasis and goal in that discussion was just to say, you're not free to disregard at your own whim this kind of authoritative but non-infallible teaching. I think he overstated his case in order to make that point. To the eighth and final objection, which was based on Cardinal Belo's understanding of all non-infallible teaching as being merely probabilistic, so that even a future reversal of teaching would not mean that it had been false in the past, to regard a teaching as probably true based on the evidence then available. I replied that this would only prove that non-definitive doctrinal judgments can be true, even in cases where they're later reversed. So if you follow Belo's argument, if you grant him his argument, it only proves at best that there could be cases of reversal where both, there could be cases of reversal where both statements are true, but it doesn't prove that they must both be true, which would be required in order to uphold the thesis that the Pope cannot err in the exercise of his authentic magisterium. Also, though, I don't really think Belo's position makes much sense, because a lot of the non-infallible teaching of popes and bishops is presented straightforwardly as true and not merely as probable. So there is a certain kind of, there was more often in the past, there were cases where propositions would be explicitly qualified as this cannot be safely taught, or this can be safely taught, where you could, where what Below says could gain some traction. But certainly not everything in the non-infallible magisterium is presented in that way. Lots of the teaching of papal encyclicals and so on are just straightforward assertions of, X, Y, or Z is the case. It's not presented as definitive, because there's no insistence that all Catholics are required to believe this in most of the cases. But it's also not presented as merely probabilistic. It's presented in the way that I was describing earlier as an opinion. So not just X, Y, or Z is probably true, but X, Y, or Z is true, which we receive with the awareness that it could be false. Hopefully that distinction makes sense. I will wrap up there, though, and if it doesn't, feel free to send any questions my way. I'll do my best to answer them.
All right. Doctor, I appreciate you so much. This has been excellent. There's a lot of questions here. Number one, this one comes from Powell. He asks, how many times has the Pope spoken infallibly ex cathedra, and how do you know this?
Oh, man. Huge question.
Right.
I'm not going to give you a precise answer. I'll give you some thoughts. at Vatican Council I, when the papal infallibility, the dogma of papal infallibility was being formulated, I referenced a couple times this speech which Bishop Gasser gave to the bishops at Vatican I, where he was involved in drafting the text and then presented to the bishops, here's what we are proposing to vote upon and promulgate as a council. And he gave a long speech, a 4-hour speech at the First Vatican Council, explaining in incredible detail how the teaching was meant to be understood. And one of the things he says, almost as a throwaway comment, so it's hard to know how literally to take this, but in the discussions about papal infallibility, some of the bishops had suggested we ought to specify like what the Pope has to say in order to speak infallibly. And you have to admit that would be super convenient. If it's like when the Pope says this, then you know, it would end all of these controversies. But Bishop Gasser's response to that was, look, the popes have already spoken ex cathedra thousands and thousands of times, and there was no specific formula, so we can't impose one now. Okay, so thousands and thousands of times. I don't know anybody who's ever come up with thousands and thousands of infallible papal teaching. So there's probably some hyperbole going on there, right? I don't think we certainly don't have to take that literally. At the same time, for him to make that comment as a kind of throwaway comment at Vatican I sort of tells you that it was the kind of comment that wouldn't raise a whole bunch of eyebrows there. Like, so this is speculative, right? I mean, we're only hypothesizing about things we can't know for sure, but that gives you the impression for sure that the bishops who formulated the definition of papal infallibility at Vatican I certainly had the idea that it applies to a lot more things than we are often accustomed to thinking about. Okay, having said, so that's one thing to think about. Second, there have been just a handful of attempts by different theologians to assemble kind of lists of infallible papal teaching. Cardinal Bilot gives about 12 examples in the early 20th century. Edmond Dublanchet, in the article on this topic in the big French Dictionary of Catholic Theology, gives a list of about 12. Neither of them claim that that's complete. They're just saying, here are some examples. Joachim Saliveri, in the Sacrae Theologiae Summae, which is one of the great manuals of dogmatic theology from the early 20th century, he references an article done by another scholar whose name I forget, who studied the first millennium looking for ex cathedra statements and came up with about 20. So the well-known ones would be like the Tome of Leo, the Formula of Pope Hormisdas, and the statement of Pope Agatho, I think, and about 17 others. So I'm sure that people could dispute over any of the individual instances, but to give you that, I hope that gives you a sense of the ballpark figures that we're thinking of. A lot of those, by the way, so some of the good candidates that look like infallible papal teaching from the second millennium are in the form of lists of condemned errors. Unigenitus, for example, in the about 1703, I think, I could be off on that, early 1700s, condemns about 101 different errors with a very definitive kind of formula at the end. So I suppose if you counted that as 101 ex cathedra statements, and you did that with a lot of that kind of document, maybe that way of counting could actually get you up into the thousands, but it certainly wouldn't be, I don't think anybody would claim that there are thousands of documents. So in terms of papal documents containing infallible teaching, my guess is that you're in the ballpark of 15 to 30, something like that, but I don't want to be pinned down on the number. And again, a lot of them would involve controversy, because the second half of the question, which I haven't got to, is how do you know? And basically the way you know is you read what Vatican I says is an ex cathedra teaching, which lays out criteria for identifying infallible teaching, and then you have to apply those criteria to the individual cases. But that's not a simple, straightforward matter. But it's also not an impossible matter. It requires a careful study of Vatican I, and I think most importantly, it requires a careful study of that speech of Bishop Gasser to understand well how those criteria are meant to be applied. So I do think if this is a subject you want to pursue, your first reading assignment is Bishop Gasser's speech. It's been translated into English and published by Ignatius Press under the title of The Gift of Infallibility. So it requires some theological sophistication, let's say, but that doesn't mean that it's not so complicated that only somebody with a PhD could get it right. I'm reminded of something Peter Kreeft once says, sometimes you think it's like only somebody with a PhD could get it wrong. There's a tendency amongst a lot of theologians to overcomplicate issues in order to confuse everybody else and get away with whatever they want to say. I'm sure somebody would probably accuse me of doing the same thing. But anyway, that's my stab at an answer to that.
Dr. Joy, let me ask you as a follow-up question. As far as the relatio here from Vatican I of, Bishop Gasser's speech, can you tell us what is the magisterial status of it?
Yeah.
Does it have some kind of magisterial weight?
No. So on its own, it certainly does not have magisterial weight, but it has what I would call, so it doesn't have juridical authority. Catholics are not under any kind of obligation to accept it in a juridical sense. It doesn't have juridical or magisterial authority. But what it does have, I would argue, is interpretive authority.
Okay.
In other words, Pastor Eternus has juridical authority. So we have to accept the teaching of Pastor Eternus. How do we know how to interpret Pastor Eternus rightly? I would say as a kind of historical tool or historical document in order to understand any text. And we do this all the time with scripture, for example, but other texts as well. In order to understand a text rightly, you have to try to understand what the author meant by what he said. And the best insight that we have available to what the authors of Pastor Eternus meant by what they said in Vatican I is that speech of Gasser. So I think it has a very high degree of interpretive authority, but that's still a different category than juridical authority. So if you disagree with Bishop Gasser about the thousands and thousands, you're certainly not committing any sin by disagreeing with that.
Yeah, no, that's a very good explanation. Now, this one is from Hercule. You did touch on this a little bit, but if you maybe want to add some to it, that would be good. So comment on the assent owed to documents of the CDF, such as Donum Vitae, when the CDF comments on reproductive science like in vitro fertilization. So if you can maybe expand on what you were saying there with Donum Veritatis 18.
Yeah, I'm not going to get into actually like the issue of in vitro fertilization, but just to comment on the authority of CDF documents. So documents of the pontifical congregations like the CDF participate in the authentic magisterium of the Pope when they are approved by the Pope. So if you scroll to the bottom, if you're on the Vatican website and you scroll to the bottom of any CDF document, you'll see, well, you either will or you will not see at the bottom a kind of formula that usually says something like, this was presented to the Pope in some kind of audience, and he approved it and ordered it to be published. Now, according to the kind of internal constitutions of how the Curia operates in Rome, that formula is a means by which the Pope gives the weight of his own magisterial authority to that text in a general kind of way. If he doesn't do that, then it's not coming from the Pope. It's coming from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. If you think for an analogy of your own diocese, so nobody's infallible in your own diocese, right? but there's still a real difference and an important difference between like things that are actually issued by the bishop. Let's say they're just disciplinary degrees, right? Things issued by the bishop versus things issued by the office of worship in the diocesan pastoral center, right? There's a real important difference. Just because I work for the bishop of the Diocese of Madison, just because I say something doesn't mean the bishop said it, unless he puts his signature on something that I write. So with the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, that's basically what's going on. Most of the time, I would say, in the doctrinal decrees of the CDF, you will find that formula of papal approval at the end, which is the Pope putting his signature on the statement so that you can say, yeah, this is the Pope teaching through the CDF. But in the case of that commentary on the concluding formula of the Profession of Faith, which is a commentary dealing with this subject about how to understand the working of the magisterium. So in the kind of studies that I do and you do, Michael, this is a very important commentary, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's good to
Right.
know that commentary doesn't have any form of papal approval.
Right.
So it's written by Cardinal Ratzinger. It's got his signature on it back when he was cardinal. So certainly it deserves a kind of respectful consideration, but it doesn't have any juridical authority, let's say, even of the non-infallible kind. So we don't even have to give the religious obsequium to it.
What do you think that is? I mean, why couldn't they just get the Pope to sign off on this thing?
I have no idea.
This was a great document. This would have been very helpful to bring into the magisterium.
Mostly it's a great document, but I think there are a couple of there are a couple of iffy parts about it, or where at least parts that are not very clearly expounded.
Sure. Sure.
But yeah, I mean, I have no idea, like historically speaking, why they didn't get the Pope's approval on that one.
Do you have time for a few more? That we do have some more questions.
Sure.
Okay. So this one is from Teresa. She asks, what are we to do when the Pope says things like follow the UN and tells us to accept things against our conscience? What do we do in those cases?
So I guess a big part of what I've been trying to say is, if what the Pope says goes against your conscience, that's not quite good enough. You have to make sure that you've formed your conscience, right? So A, recognize that your conscience could be wrong. I'm not meaning to comment on the UN specifically or anything like that, but in the hypothetical case, we need to be aware of the fact that our own conscience could be wrong, and we need to form it better and learn more. And so we can't just, it's not as simple as saying, well, I disagree, so I don't have to believe that. But our conscience in matters of faith, especially if we're talking about, right, our conscience in matters of faith has to be formed primarily by divine revelation itself, scripture and tradition, as transmitted to us by the infallible teaching of the church. So in the hypothetical case where the Pope would propose something contrary to what we believe by faith, then the conscience should be clear. We can't accept that. It's a much more difficult case when the Pope is just commenting on something like the UN. I mean, that's not even faith or morals. Like whether the UN is a good idea or not is a matter, it is outside the scope of faith or morals. So he's probably just out of line by commenting on that, frankly. And it doesn't require much. I mean, again, it should be given the respectful consideration that the Pope deserves, but it doesn't have to, certainly doesn't bind the conscience. So I guess just to reiterate that a little more clearly, one issue would be determining whether is the Pope teaching something here about a matter of faith or morals, or is he giving his own kind of opinion about a purely political question. Mm-hmm. If he is teaching something in a matter of faith or morals, then we shouldn't reject it because we happen to disagree with it. We should only withhold our assent to it if it conflicts with something that we hold by a higher authority.
Colin asks, many pre-Vatican II theologians teach the infallible security or infallible safety of non-extraordinary or ordinary papal teachings. What is the theological status or note for this opinion?
Right, so that's the Cardinal Franzelin thesis that I mentioned. So Franzlin was the first one to teach that in the late 1900s. He was very prominent and influential. A lot of theologians picked up his idea. Like Joseph Clifford Fenton is a prominent example in American theology in the middle of the 20th century. But also, by no means was that universally accepted by Catholic theologians even before Vatican II. So for every theologian you can find who endorses Franzlin's opinion, I'm pretty sure I could match him with another theologian who didn't. So that means it qualifies. The theological note for that is called theological opinion. It was a theological opinion. It doesn't even qualify as a common opinion, and it certainly doesn't qualify as a consensus of theologians. So theological opinion means Catholics are free to hold it, but they're also free not to hold it. And I happen to think the reasons against it are better than the reasons for it.
Patrick asks, Dr. Joy, when you say that we must assent to a papal teaching, but not necessarily show external respect to it, what are illicit ways that we can withhold that external respect?
Oh, I didn't mean to say that. I hope I didn't say that. I was trying to say that, so I think you should show external respect for papal teaching. I was trying to say that external respect is not all that's being asked of us. It also, generally speaking, when we're talking about this category of non-infallible papal teaching, not only should we show external respect for it, we should also give internal submission of will and intellect. That's what I meant to say regarding the general case. Now, in the hypothetical case where a pope could teach something contrary to what we know by faith, then we would not be able to give the internal assent to it. We would have to disagree with it internally. We would have to be careful about how we expressed our disagreement externally to make sure that it was still done in a respectful way, which usually means not just running around the internet yelling about how the Pope's a heretic. It usually requires a bit more delicacy and respect than that. But it doesn't mean that we're not allowed to express it at all. So canon law makes provision that I'm not going to be able to cite this verbatim, but there is a place for letting our pastors know respectfully when we think that they're messing up, and this would be a prime case of that.
Yeah, that's Canon 212. The laity are able to express their concerns and even publicly with each other. Yeah. Let's see. Knight asks, while provisional assent or opinionative assent may be required, what about something like the death penalty where we know by reason and church history that the current church contradicts it?
Right. So if we know, if it's a dogma of faith based on scripture and tradition, that the death penalty is not intrinsically evil, that it can be in some cases justified, then if a pope were to teach contrary to that, and what exactly Pope Francis says in the new text of the Catechism is a little odd and hard to make sense of. It sure looks like it's saying that the death penalty is intrinsically evil, but he does use the word inadmissible, which is not a normal theological word. So let me tactfully not take a position on what Pope Francis has taught about the death penalty, but just say that if a pope were to teach that the death penalty is intrinsically wrong in the authentic magisterium, we would have to weigh this like obligation to give religious submission to that teaching with our obligation to give firm and definitive assent to the dogmatic teaching of the church through history, which is that the death penalty is not intrinsically evil. That's what I was trying to talk about. When you have conflicting obligations, the lower obligation has to give way, and you have to stick with the teaching of scripture and tradition as it's been taught infallibly by the church and handed down, rather than abandoning that in favor of a merely authentic but not infallible statement of a current pope.
Yeah, and from what I gather from the chat, some are basically asking the question, how do we weigh documents? How do we assess a magisterial document and know if it's teaching something irreformably or non-definitively?
Okay, yeah, great question. I mean, that's like the $64,000 question right there for sure, is how to tell the difference between the two, because these are two categories. The difference between them is extremely important. How to tell. I'm going to say, for those of you who really want to do your homework, go read Bishop Gasser's speech. He talks about that a lot. For those of you who want a 6-sentence summary instead of that, I will do my best. I would say that there are 3 criteria for infallible teaching. One is that the Pope has to be acting as Pope and not just as a private person. Now, most of the time, that checkbox is hit. So, like interviews on airplanes are going to be ruled out, but like papal documents are pretty much all the Pope acting as Pope. Matter of faith and morals, again, there will be some cases where the Pope is just commenting on the environment or whatever, but most of the time in your papal documents, that checkbox is going to be hit as well. In most papal encyclical letters, certainly in the catechism, all of these kind of things, you've got the Pope acting as Pope in his official capacity, and it's about faith and morals for the most part. The third and last criteria is the one that really makes all the difference. It's the key to look out for, so to speak. And that's the definitiveness of the teaching, which has to be expressed in some way. So Bishop Gasser says this specifically in that speech. He calls this the characteristic note of infallible teaching, which means like the defining characteristic. And he says, because that's so important, it has to be expressed in some way. The difference between teaching something, which is not infallible, and defining something, which is infallible, is basically the difference between, it's the difference between a teacher and a lawgiver, if you want. So if I stand here as a teacher and tell my classroom full of students 2 + 2 = 4, I'm proposing a truth to them to be accepted, but I'm not proposing it on the basis of my own authority. I'm proposing it as a teacher. Whereas if I say 2 + 2 = 4, and if you disagree, you have to leave the room, like 2 + 2 = 4, and you better believe it or you're in trouble, then I'm not only teaching, I'm also requiring assent. So the presentation of truth as a teacher is meant to obtain assent. That's what teachers do, but it's not explicitly requiring assent all the time. Just for an example, if the Pope says Jesus rose from the dead, he's teaching you about a matter of faith and morals. But if he says Jesus rose from the dead and all Catholics have to believe that, then he's not only teaching, he's also defining, which means he's requiring a definitive acceptance of that teaching. So when you're reading a papal document, that's what you want to be looking for to identify infallible teaching. Is the Pope just telling me about stuff? Or is he telling me I have to accept this stuff? Right? I think that difference is actually really easily noticeable if you're looking at it from that perspective. Is he just talking about faith and morals, which is authentic magisterium? Or is he talking about my obligation to accept this teaching of faith and morals? That's when he's defining, that's when it's definitive, infallible, irreformable. And that's not that common in most papal documents.
Okay. That's excellent. Dr. Joy, I have a question for you. It's very much related to what we're discussing here, but not, explicitly directly on our topic here, but you're the guy that would know. We've been talking a lot on the show and off the air about something that we come across with, for example, Father Francis Sullivan in his book on the Magisterium, believe it's chapter 5. He says that, you have the conditions that Vatican I lays out for papal infallibility, but there does appear to be some preconditions, if you will, one of them being that, the Pope has to be free to whenever he's making this definition. Another being that he has to consult the deposit of faith, which of course Dei Verbum tells us that this includes the bishops. So the question is, does the Pope, when he has to consult the deposit of faith first before he makes his definition, is he in some way required to consult some or all of the bishops, since they're the teaching authority in the church and one of the vehicles in which tradition is transmitted? Or can he just lock himself in the room? He has his Bible, he has his Denzinger, he doesn't have to talk to any bishop. He's good to go. And that definition that he now gives that meets the conditions of Vatican I is now binding, and you cannot dissent from it.
Okay, yeah, great question. So first I'll say Bishop Gasser, in the speech I've been talking about, addresses that explicitly at some length. So that's worth reading. Secondly, I will say, summarizing what Bishop Gasser says there a little bit, the Pope, so this requirement that he consults the bishops, or at least some of the bishops, is a certain kind of requirement, but it's a different kind of requirement. So it's a requirement of prudence for the Pope to do that, which means he would be a fool not to. But it's not a requirement in the sense of a criteria for his teaching to be infallible. So we would never be permitted to say, since the Pope didn't consult, therefore we don't have to accept the teaching. So we do have to accept, I think Francis Sullivan, I forget if he uses this terminology, but often this is called like an a priori understanding of infallibility. So yes, infallibility is supposed to be understood a priori in this way, that if, and the reasoning for that, by the way, is because the purpose of infallibility is to protect the faithful, Catholic faithful generally, so that it's to allow all of us, not only the scholars, to know what we have to believe in order to be saved. And for most Catholics, that means the criteria for infallibility have to be externally verifiable relatively easily. And whether or not something is infallible can't depend on like an insider's knowledge. Otherwise, what we have to believe for salvation depends on an insider's knowledge, which is basically Gnosticism. So what is this requirement? So Bishop Gasser does talk about the Pope is required in a certain sense to consult certainly divine revelation and the tradition, and usually also the other bishops of the church, in the sense that infallibility is not like inspiration. There's no pipeline to God. God doesn't tell him what to write in a magisterial decree, which means the only way he can know what's true in any certain theological question or doctrinal question is the same way any of us would know what's true, by consulting scripture, tradition, the faith of the church, the teaching of the bishops, etc. So the Pope's way of concluding what he should teach, he doesn't have any real advantage over the rest of us. So he needs to consult all those sources the same way any of us would need to consult all of those sources in order to formulate an opinion on any doctrinal or theological subject. If the Pope fails to do that, and just decides to pen his ex cathedra definition with his Bible and Denzinger in a room, although Bible and Denzinger, let's say, like, okay, that is at least consulting something, right? Yeah. But if he were to be reckless and just say, well, I'm pretty sure this is true, I'm just going to write it out and promulgate it ex cathedra, what he's doing is taking his life into his own hands. So infallibility doesn't mean God will tell the Pope the answer. It means God will stop the Pope from defining it if he's wrong. So that means if the Pope, there's a great story of Pope Sixtus, I forget which one, famous story, right? I see you nodding, yeah?
Yeah.
Who dashed off a translation, a fresh translation of the whole Bible, overnight, thinking he was a brilliant Latin scholar when in fact he wasn't. And then drew up this very thundering kind of papal bull, asserting with the full weight of all his apostolic authority that this new translation contains no errors in faith and morals, and it contained some laughers, and was like gonna promulgate this and dropped dead. So that, to me, that's a great illustration of what papal infallibility is actually all about. Like, a pope would be a fool to not approach an infallible declaration without great fear and trembling, because if he's got it wrong, what that means is God's going to stop him. So a pope had better be really confident that what he's going to say is in accordance with divine revelation and does reflect the faith of the church, and so on. And I think that's part of why you see that it's relatively rare in the history of the church, because it takes some courage, I think. It would take some courage to do that. So I hope that helps a little bit. I don't know if
Oh,
that
it
answers
does.
every question, but
Basically, he locks himself in the room. Let's say he ignores scripture, he ignores tradition. He just decides to pin it down. Um, Prudentially, he's wrong, and in this case, God would probably kill him if he's
well,
in error.
right. So he's rolling the dice. I would
Yeah.
say he's rolling the dice. He's going to say, I'm gonna throw this out there. I'm going to try it. And if he happens to hit on the truth of the actual doctrine, then God would let him go ahead and promulgate it. And the fact that God let him go ahead and promulgate it would give the rest of us all the assurance that we needed. Say,
Mhm.
okay, we accept this as an infallible statement.
Yeah.
But if he rolls the dice and he gets it wrong, then the way infallibility is meant to be understood is not that he would go ahead and promulgate it, but we would have some way of knowing that it wasn't actually true.
Yeah.
The way infallibility is supposed to work is that he would be prevented from promulgating it, either by a sudden death or a sickness, or like he would lose track of the papers as he was going out there to like read the thing and it would disappear,
Hmm.
or he would get tongue tied and not be able to say it or something. I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
This is part
Yeah.
of like just this is
Yeah.
this is all wrapped up in our faith in divine providence, to govern the church
Sure.
in such a way that those things don't happen. And usually divine providence works harmoniously and sweetly so that people aren't dropping dead all over the place.
Sure.
Usually providence works internally, where God would be, not inspiration in the biblical sense, but I mean where God would be moving somebody by grace to realize I'm doing something dumb and I should stop and consult people.
So last question for you. You were talking about reversals. One teaching can reverse another, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the first one was wrong. Could you maybe comment on a case in which a reversal was made and the original teaching was wrong? Is there such an example in the papal magisterium where it was not just a reversal, but the original teaching that was reversed was
Yeah.
actually erroneous?
So I think there are plenty of controversial cases where it is at least claimed that that happened, although most of them are pretty difficult to sort out.
Hmm.
The one that seems most obvious to me is John the 22nd's teaching about the delayed beatific vision. So
Yeah.
Pope John the 22nd in the I want to say early 1300s or late 1200s, I forget exactly. Before he was Pope, as a private scholar, he advanced the opinion that the souls of the saints do not see the beatific vision until after the final judgment. And then when he was Pope, he taught that same thing in some of his sermons, and was there was a negative reaction. Lots of theologians, there's a big controversy. A lot of people were accusing him of heresy, and in fact, that is heretical. And so there's some controversy about whether his sermons count as authentic magisterium, I guess. Like, did he always only teach that as a private theologian, or did he actually teach that in some sense with the papal authority? Papal sermons are pretty low level if they do have authority, but they don't seem exactly like a private scholar. So there's some controversy there for sure, but in any way, he certainly was wrong. And the very next pope defined the opposite as a dogma. So Yeah, I think that's at least the clearest case, I think, although even there's a little bit of controversy about the status of his erroneous teaching.
Well, and that raises one final then follow-up question. Is there maybe a place that we could go to consult to determine what qualifies as a papal magisterial teaching? For example, a sermon or an allocution or something like that. Is there a place that we could go to that would give us kind of a good guideline?
Okay, so like in the from the late 19th century onwards, it's relatively easy because all of the official papal stuff is published in the Acta Apostolica Sedis. So if something is published in the Acts of the Apostolic See, something that the Pope says, then that's clear that it's being presented as something of the Apostolic See and not just of the Pope as a private scholar.
Mm-hmm.
When you go further back in history before there was that practice, it can get a little bit trickier for sure. The principle that you have to apply is just whether he was saying it kind of in the function of his office. And I would say most of the things that come down to us from history from popes were said in the virtue of their office. Like if they were offhand comments in dinner conversations, they usually didn't get recorded. Right. And not that many of the popes throughout history were like publishing theological treatises on the side. Like Pope Benedict did that with his Jesus of Nazareth books, but that was really quite exceptional. So I would say for the most part, if a pope said it, the assumption is that he said it in his capacity as pope to some degree. Now, obviously, like I said, a sermon is going to have a lot less weight than an encyclical letter or something like that. But I think there would have to be some kind of positive evidence that it was just a private person. A good analogy to think about this is like with our U.S. government. So everybody knows, I think, really easily the difference between Donald Trump tweeting and Donald Trump giving an executive order. Like, so agree or disagree with anything about Donald Trump doesn't matter. Doesn't matter for present purposes. Everybody knows that what he says on Twitter is not law, is not coming from the president. It's coming from Donald Trump. Whereas an executive order, even if it's a bad one, is still coming from the president as president. So when a pope, even in a sermon, you might say, okay, that's coming from him kind of in his capacity as a priest. So that one is a little bit difficult, right? But for the most part, it's fairly clear, the encyclical letters and stuff like that are coming from the Pope as Pope, whereas the offhand comments, the interviews with reporters and so on, you're getting much more of the private opinions.
Dr. Joy, this has been excellent. I really appreciate you because, first of all, a lot of people are commenting and saying they loved the format, and I have to agree with them. I love the fact that you brought the disputed questions format. That's awesome. Hats off to you. And then you did an excellent job with your presentation and the answering of the questions. So, Dr. Joy, I'd love to have you on again to do this again if you're willing.
Well, my pleasure anytime. I'm glad to hear the disputed questions went over well because that was definitely you guys were the guinea pigs. So
once again, thank you so much, Dr. Joy. And everyone, thank you for watching. Please don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, and share this on your social media. But until next time,